Welcome to 3-in-1, Scripture Insight, exploring Scripture, human nature, and the deeper questions of existence, hosted by Chang Du.
Right now, as you listen to my voice, the DNA inside your brain cells is actively contorting. It's folding and tying itself into microscopic three-dimensional loops just so you can process and remember what I'm saying.
Which is just an incredible thing to visualize.
It really is. And, in 2024 and 2025, scientific consensus solidified around this reality. This is the literal physical architecture of human memory. But what if those microscopic loops inside your cells were also the exact battleground for your soul?
It is a profoundly jarring juxtaposition. I mean, when you really think about it.
Yeah.
You have, on one side, the absolute frontier of modern molecular biology. And on the other, you have these ancient questions of morality and, well, human spiritual state.
And bridging that gap is exactly what we're doing today, because the core of this deep dive revolves around a very specific source document we've been analyzing.
Right.
The author, Pastor Du, attempts what he calls a truth integration.
A truth integration.
Yeah, that's his term. He takes these cutting-edge, freshly published scientific papers, and we're talking dense quantitative research from top-peer journals here, like Cell Genomics and Nature Neuroscience.
Heavy peer-reviewed science.
Exactly. And he maps those physical microscopic discoveries directly onto theological teachings about the human soul, the bondage of sin, and spiritual intuition.
And I think it's crucial to set our parameters right out of the gate here.
Oh, absolutely.
Our goal today is not to validate or invalidate the religious claims being made in this text. We aren't here to debate the existence of sin or to, advocate for a specific theological worldview.
No, not at all.
Instead, we are neutral explorers. We're examining an incredibly ambitious intellectual artifact. We are analyzing how the author constructs this bridge between objective neurogenomics and subjective theology.
Right, because whether you agree with the theology or not, it's just a fascinating exercise in seeing how raw scientific data can be synthesized into this profound moral narrative. So I want you, the listener, to approach this as an exercise in exploring a totally integrated worldview.
Keep an open mind as to how the argument is built.
Exactly, because to understand the theology this author is proposing, we actually have to spend some serious time with the science he's building upon.
Because if we don't understand the physical foundation,
the spiritual metaphor won't carry any weight. It just falls flat.
Right.
So let's start with the baseline of how we understand memory. Because for the longest time, the way I thought about memory formation was almost entirely chemical.
Like most people, yeah.
The old paradigm was all about epigenetics and, chemical tags.
Yeah, that was indeed the prevailing model for a long time. And it's important to understand why it made so much sense to the scientific community before we look at this new paradigm shift.
Right, because it wasn't wrong, it was just
incomplete.
Yeah.
In the traditional epigenetic model, we viewed the DNA strand as a relatively static entity.
Okay.
Think of your genetic code as an enormous, unimaginably long row of books in a grand library.
Oh, I like that. A library.
Yeah. And the books themselves, the genes, they don't move. They just sit on the shelves.
Right. They are just the passive storage of information. The instructions are just waiting there.
Precisely. So the question was, how does the brain learn? How does it form a memory without changing the books themselves?
Because you can't go around rewriting your DNA every time you learn a phone number.
Exactly. The answer was surface-level chemistry. When a neuron needed to form a memory, the cellular machinery would basically walk down the aisle of this library and place little chemical sticky notes on specific books.
Little chemical sticky notes? Like methyl groups or something?
Methyl groups, acetyl groups, yes. And these sticky notes told the cell, read this book more often, or ignore this book completely.
Wow. Okay.
It was a brilliant system of regulation, but it still treated the DNA strand as a fixed, unmoving ladder.
So the architecture of the library never changed?
No. Only the labeling system did.
I've always liked the sticky note analogy because, well, it makes sense of how our environment or our experiences could affect our genetics without actually mutating the underlying code.
Right. The books are still the same books.
But this source text highlights a massive disruption in that way of thinking. The 2024 and 2025 research cited by Pastor Du completely shatters the idea of a static library.
It really does. It's a fundamental shift.
The text points out that when neurons form memories and engage in high-level cognition, The changes aren't just chemical tags on the surface.
No, it's much more dramatic.
The DNA inside the nucleus of the neuron actually undergoes three-dimensional spatial folding and remodeling. It physically changes shape.
And this is where the sheer scale of the biological complexity starts to become clear.
Yeah.
We are no longer talking about adding a tiny chemical tag to a stationary object. We are talking about the entire architectural structure of the genome dynamically reorganizing itself in three-dimensional space within the nucleus.
That is just wild to try and wrap my head around. To visualize this, let's move away from the static library analogy.
Okay, what's a better way to look at it?
I want to use an analogy of DNA origami.
Oh, DNA origami.
I like that. Instead of thinking of your genetic code as a flat string of letters or, a fixed ladder sitting in a pool of fluid.
Which is how every high school textbook draws it.
Right. Instead of that, imagine it actively twisting. Imagine a piece of complex origami paper that is constantly folding, bending, and reshaping itself into new 3D configurations every single time you learn a new fact or form a new memory.
The paper itself is morphing.
Yes. Morphing to bring different parts of the design into contact with each other.
The origami visual is incredibly apt because it captures the deliberate, functional nature of the folding. It's not random tangling.
It's purposeful.
Very. The scientific confirmation here is that the 3D spatial structure of the genetic material is dynamically remodeling itself to facilitate cognitive function.
So it's building a structure to think.
Essentially, yes. Different genes that might be millions of base pairs apart on the linear strand are brought physically together by this folding process.
But let me challenge the text's reliance on this specific shift, because Pastor Du goes out of his way to highlight the movement from chemical tags to 3D spatial structures.
He does focus heavily on that distinction.
Why is that distinction so structurally important to his entire thesis? I mean, if a chemical sticky note gets the job done and makes the neuron fire, why does the author need the DNA to literally fold?
That is a very sharp question.
Isn't chemistry enough to explain how a brain remembers where it left the car keys?
Well, it actually reveals the underlying mechanics of the author's argument. Chemistry alone implies a surface-level modification.
Yeah.
A chemical tag is an alteration on the structure. But three-dimensional folding is an alteration of the structure.
Of the structure itself.
Yes. It fundamentally reframes our understanding of a neuron's nucleus. By focusing on 3D architecture, the text establishes the brain's internal environment not just as a soup of chemicals, but as a dynamic, shifting physical space.
So it's the difference between, like, painting a wall a different color versus literally moving the walls of the room around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for the theological arguments that Pastor Du makes later in the text, he desperately needs the physical reality of human thought to be architectural, not just chemical.
Why?
Because, as we'll see, his spiritual metaphors require a physical structure that can be manipulated, distorted, and broken.
Oh, wow. I see where this is going.
Right. You cannot easily tie a knot in a chemical tag.
No, you can't.
But you can tie a knot in a physical three-dimensional structure.
He is laying the groundwork for a physical manifestation of a spiritual problem.
Precisely. The architecture is the point.
Okay, that makes perfect sense of why he selected this specific branch of neurogenomics. So let's look closer at that architecture.
Let's do it.
Now that we have this image of DNA folding like origami, we need to understand the precise shape it takes. Because the source text doesn't just say it folds.
No, it's very specific.
It points to a highly specific mechanism grounded in a particular paper. And the title of the paper cited is, it's dense, but it's the anchor for everything that follows.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
It really is. The title is Learning Induces Lasting Chromatin Loops That Support Robust Gene Expression During Memory Recall.
Right. And if we break that apart, we find the absolute linchpin of the author's integration.
Let's start with the phrase chromatin loops.
Okay, so chromatin is the overarching package. It's a combination of the DNA itself and the proteins that it wraps around inside the cell.
So it's the DNA and its packaging.
Exactly. When the research refers to a chromatin loop, it describes a literal event where the long strand of DNA bends back on itself, kind of like a hairpin.
Okay, like a loop on a roller coaster.
Yeah, and it brings two distant segments of the genetic code into direct physical contact and anchors them there.
But the word in that title that I just cannot stop thinking about is lasting.
Lasting chromatin loops.
Yes. That one word changes everything about how we perceive learning. It implies that the act of learning isn't just a fleeting electrical spark zipping across a synapse.
It's not just a flash of energy.
No. Learning literally leaves a semi-permanent physical loop in your genetic material.
It alters you physically.
You learn to speak a new language, you learn to play the piano, or you memorize a poem, and your DNA ties itself into a specific enduring loop to hold on to that capability.
Yes, the persistence of the structure is what makes it a memory rather than just a passing thought.
That's beautiful.
And if we look at the second half of that title, it explains the function of these structures. It says they support robust gene expression during memory recall.
Robust gene expression. Let's unpack that.
Gene expression, simply put, is the process where the cell actually reads the instructions of the DNA and acts upon them. It manufactures the proteins necessary to fire the neuron.
So when we recall a memory, the cell has to read the blueprint for that memory.
Precisely. And what this 2024-2025 science is demonstrating is that these three-dimensional loops are the physical mechanisms that allow the brain to efficiently and powerfully or robustly read those specific genes.
So the loop is necessary for the reading.
Yes. If the loop isn't there, or if the loop collapses,
Yeah.
the cell cannot effectively read the genes, and the memory cannot be retrieved.
The physical loop is the necessary bridge between the stored information and the active, conscious act of remembering.
That's exactly right.
I want to make this tangible for everyone listening. Wherever you are right now, I just want you to pause for a second. Think about a highly specific, vivid memory.
Just conjure one up.
Maybe it's the distinctive smell of rain on hot asphalt from your childhood, or the precise feeling of holding a loved one's hand.
Something that feels very real to you.
According to the scientific consensus cited in this text, the very act of you pulling that memory out of the archives of your mind right now is not magic.
No, it is highly mechanical.
It involves microscopic chromatin loops actively holding their shape inside the nucleus of millions of neurons in your brain.
Right at this very moment.
That structural loop is physically facilitating the robust expression of that memory. You are experiencing the subjective feeling of nostalgia, but biologically, your DNA is executing a complex piece of physical architecture to allow you to feel it.
It is a profoundly beautiful biological reality. The sheer microscopic coordination required just to remember a smell is staggering.
It's unbelievable.
It really represents the absolute pinnacle of functional complexity in the human body.
And it is right here, at the absolute height of this incredible microscopic science, that the source text pulls off a massive, sweeping philosophical pivot.
This is where things get really interesting.
We're zooming all the way out from the electron microscope, and we are stepping directly up to the pulpit.
Yes.
The text takes this precise scientific mechanism, the physical DNA looping to facilitate cognition, and applies it to a sweeping theological framework. This is the truth integration Pastor Du talks about.
And the transition in the text is jarring, but it's methodical.
How so?
Well, the author begins this pivot by establishing the frontal brain, the frontal lobe, as the biological center of human consciousness.
Okay, which is somewhat standard, right?
Right. From a secular neuroscientific standpoint, the frontal lobe is indeed heavily involved in higher-order executive function, decision-making, and personality.
The stuff that makes us human.
Exactly. But the text pushes this definition significantly further. It defines the frontal brain not just as the seat of logic, but as the exclusive center of spiritual intuition.
Let's focus on that term, spiritual intuition.
It's a loaded term.
It really is, because the text is essentially claiming that humans possess a biological sensory organ for the divine.
A sensory organ, yes.
Just as the occipital lobe processes vision and the temporal lobe processes hearing, the author is arguing that the frontal lobe's highest function is to process spiritual reality.
That is exactly the framework. It posits that connecting with the divine or perceiving spiritual truths is not merely an abstract emotional feeling.
Right, it's not just a vibe.
No, it's a cognitive process that relies on the physical hardware of the brain, specifically the frontal lobe.
And here is where the text introduces a claim that is guaranteed to stop any reader in their track.
Oh yeah, this is the big claim.
Pastor Dudokas claims that this frontal brain, this intended center of profound spiritual intuition, is currently operating at less than 5% of its functional capacity.
Less than 5%.
Less than 5%. And the reason for this massive failure, the text states unequivocally that it is due to the bondage of sin.
Which is a huge leap.
It's a massive leap. Now, just to be clear, secular neuroscience would laugh that 5% capacity metric out of the room.
Oh, absolutely.
We've all heard the old myth that humans only use 10% of their brains, and scientists have spent decades debunking that, proving that we use virtually all of our brain throughout the day.
Right. The brain is highly efficient. It wouldn't waste energy on unused tissue.
Exactly. So my question is, how does the author actually defend that 5% number? Does he try to extract that from the neurogenomic paper about chromatin loops, or does he just impose it from his theology?
He largely imposes the metric from his theological framework.
Yeah.
But, and this is important, he does so by entirely redefining the baseline of what the human brain is supposed to do.
Okay, redefining the baseline. Walk me through that.
It's a brilliant rhetorical move if you analyze his logic. As you mentioned, secular neuroscience measures brain capacity based on evolutionary needs.
Right.
So our brain is functioning at 100% capacity relative to what it evolved to do. Survive, reproduce, build tools, solve problems.
Hunt, gather, all that stuff.
Exactly. But the text rejects that evolutionary baseline entirely. The text argues that the brain was originally designed for total unhindered communion with the divine, a 100% capacity for spiritual intuition.
Oh, wow. I see what you mean.
Therefore, the fact that we use our brains primarily for secular earthly tasks is framed not as a success of evolution, but as a catastrophic failure of intended design.
The limitation isn't a feature, it's a bug.
Exactly.
In an evolutionary framework, our limitations make perfect sense. We are as smart as we needed to be to survive on the savannah.
Right.
We didn't need to be able to intuitively comprehend the fabric of the universe to outrun a lion. So we don't have that capacity.
Evolutionary efficiency.
But the text is saying, no, we were built to comprehend the fabric of the universe.
Precisely. And so the text frames human limitation as literal frontal brain damage.
Brain damage.
It is a narrative of a fallen state, mapped directly onto the frontal lobe. The author uses the concept of the bondage of sin not merely as a description of moral failing or ethical shortcomings.
It's not just doing bad things.
No, he elevates sin to the level of a biological pathogen.
A biological pathogen.
It is a destructive force that actively damages biological tissue and suppresses cognitive function.
So that 5% capacity claim, it's presented as an absolute tragedy. It's a narrative of catastrophic loss.
Yes, a devastating loss of potential.
We are walking around with this magnificent biological machinery, the DNA origami, the chromatin loops, that was supposedly designed for total spiritual enlightenment.
Right.
But because of this pathogen of sin or bondage, we are trapped at 5%. We are essentially operating in the dark, barely scraping by with basic survival cognition.
That is the exact sentiment the text conveys. And the intellectual ambition of the author's integration is that he doesn't leave this as a vague, macro-level concept.
He grounds it.
Yes. He doesn't just say sin clouds your mind. He takes this massive cosmic theological idea of spiritual bondage and zooms all the way back down into the microscopic world.
Back to the loops.
Back to the loops. He uses the science from the first half of his argument to show us exactly, physically, what that damage looks like inside the nucleus of the cell.
Which brings us to the most fascinating synthesis in the entire document.
This is the crux of it.
This is where the biological science of the chromatin loops and the theology of spiritual bondage violently crash into each other. Pastor Dew perfectly overlaps the two, creating a vivid, literal metaphor out of the biological data.
The text claims that this spiritual bondage manifests microscopically as structural failure.
Structural failure.
Remember the beautiful 3D folding we discussed? The elegant DNA origami that brings distant genes together to form memories?
Yeah, the functional shape.
Pastor Dew asserts that because of the influence of sin, the DNA in 3D space becomes incorrectly folded and knotted.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the mechanics of this claim.
Go for it.
If healthy memory formation and healthy cognitive intuition is this beautiful, highly functional DNA origami folding perfectly to read a gene,
Right.
the author is saying that sin acts like a physical disruptor.
Yes.
It's like someone coming in, grabbing that delicate origami paper, crumpling it up, and tying it in literal knots so that the cellular machinery can't read the instructions anymore.
The loop fails.
The loop fails.
That is exactly the mechanism he is proposing. And the text uses incredibly evocative language to drive this point home.
What does it say?
It says, this incorrect folding and knotting is, quote, like being bound by the enemy with ropes.
Bound by the enemy with ropes.
The spiritual concept of being tied down by dark forces is mapped onto the physical reality of a knotted genetic strand.
That is heavy, loaded theological language.
Very heavy.
But what astounds me is how the text immediately grounds that imagery. The author doesn't just leave it as poetry.
No, he ties it back to the science.
In parenthesis right next to that phrase, the text points to the hard science again, specifically citing abnormalities of histones and chromatin loops.
Right.
Now, the text brings up histones here, which we haven't touched on yet.
We should definitely explain histones.
Yeah, because I've always understood histones in a purely structural sense. They are the little protein spools that DNA wraps around to keep itself organized so it doesn't get tangled in the
I
nucleus.
think that's a great way to describe them. They are the spools.
But seeing them framed in this text as the literal site of spiritual bondage is so jarring.
It is.
How is he bridging the gap between a structural protein spool and the concept of an enemy's rope? I mean, that's just a wild leap to make, right?
It's an audacious bridge to build, for sure. But, as you correctly noted, histones are the spools. If the DNA strand is the thread, the histones are the spools that manage it.
Okay.
The complex folding we talked about, the chromatin loops, relies entirely on these histones moving and shifting in precise coordination.
So they have to be working perfectly.
Exactly. When the text points to abnormalities of histones, it is pointing to a physical breakdown in the spooling mechanism.
The thread gets tangled.
The thread gets tangled. The loop becomes a knot. The author argues that spiritual blockages, what he previously defined as spiritual intuition blockage, are not just vague metaphorical feelings of being disconnected from God or experiencing moral doubt.
They aren't just feelings.
No. They have a physical, microscopic, quantifiable footprint in your cells.
The tangling of the histones is the physical manifestation of the spiritual blockage.
Precisely.
This completely changes the metaphor. The enemy's ropes aren't just a metaphor for temptation or bad habits or psychological depression.
No, it's literalized.
The text is literalizing them. The enemy's ropes are the knotted DNA loops.
The spiritual bondage translates perfectly, one-to-one, into biological bondage.
And if we analyze the underlying logic of this, it reveals a fascinating shift in how we usually understand cause and effect in human behavior.
Yes, it raises a profound question about causality in the author's worldview.
Walk me through that. What do you mean by causality in this context?
Well, in traditional secular science, the arrow of causality flows upwards.
Upwards.
The micro dictates the macro.
Meaning the small things control the big things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your DNA folds a certain way due to chemical or environmental factors,
Right.
which causes your brain to function a certain way, which results in your behavior, your thoughts, and your feelings.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you feel depressed or disconnected, a neurobiologist would look for the micro-level cause.
Like an epigenetic misfold or a neurotransmitter imbalance?
Yes. They look for the physical thing that is generating that macro-level feeling. The physical creates the abstract.
Right. Biology is the foundation of psychology. We are essentially our biology.
Precisely. But this truth integration flips the arrow of causality entirely backward.
Backward.
The macro dictates the micro.
Oh, I see. The spiritual state is the cause, and the biological misfold is merely the symptom.
Exactly. The text proposes a universe where moral, ethical, or spiritual states, like the existence of sin or the influence of a spiritual enemy, have immediate causal consequences on the physical 3D geometry of human DNA.
Wait, so the abstract thing forces the physical thing to change?
Yes. A spiritual event forces a biological misfold. If you engage in sin, or if you are under spiritual bondage, that abstract reality exerts a physical force on your histones, causing them to tangle.
The theology is literally driving the biology.
The macro dictates the micro.
If I'm reading the implications of this correctly, it means the author views the physical body not as the source of our consciousness, but as a sort of canvas that displays the state of our soul.
A canvas for the soul. That's a beautiful way to put it.
The soul acts and the DNA reacts.
Yes.
So let's synthesize this entire worldview for you, the listener, because it is a profound and demanding way to view reality.
It really requires you to shift your entire perspective.
It does. If you step inside the logic of Pastor Du's text, you are living in a reality where every spiritual failing, every moment of moral compromise, every bondage you experience isn't just a philosophical mark on some cosmic ledger.
It's not just a tally mark.
No. It is a physical knot being violently tied in the very center of your cellular consciousness.
Inside your own brain cells.
In this worldview, your frontal brain is a suppressed engine. It is a Ferrari being forced to drive at 5 miles an hour, running at a tiny fraction of its intended power.
That 5% opacity.
Right. And all because the microscopic architecture required to connect to the divine has been physically crumpled up by the realities of a fallen world.
It is a worldview that demands total, uncompromising integration.
Total integration.
It refuses to let science be strictly secular and isolated in the laboratory.
And it equally refuses to let theology be strictly abstract and isolated in the church.
Exactly. By linking the absolute frontier of 2024 neurogenomics, the physical reality of lasting chromatin loops with ancient historical concepts of spiritual warfare, the text creates a thoroughly modern mythology.
A modern mythology.
Yes, and it is a mythology written entirely in the precise language of molecular biology.
It is truly a wild intellectual journey to trace this author's logic from start to finish. I mean, just to recap the terrain we've covered today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We started with a foundational shift in scientific understanding, moving away from simple chemical tags, the sticky notes on the library books.
Right, the static DNA model.
And we moved to the realization that our DNA actively performs intricate origami, forming 3D chromatin loops to physically support our memories and cognition. We explored how learning creates a lasting structural change in the architecture of our minds.
The lasting loops.
The lasting loops. And then we followed the source text as it executed that breathtaking pivot, bringing in the theological claim that the frontal lobe is our spiritual sensory organ.
And that these very loops are the site of our spiritual downfall.
Exactly. The text argues that the structural integrity of our genetics is constantly being knotted by the bondage of sin, limiting our capacity for spiritual intuition to a mere 5%.
We've seen how the author takes the objective data of a genetic misfold, an abnormality in a histone, and creatively reinterprets it as the enemy's ropes.
It is a masterclass in demonstrating how empirical scientific data can be harnessed, reframed, and repurposed to support a deeply complex theological narrative.
Whether one agrees with the conclusions or not, the mechanics of the integration are fascinating.
They really are. It forces you to look at the intersection of these two fields in a completely novel way.
It certainly makes you think differently about your own biology.
And that leaves me with one final thought, something I want to hand over to you, the listener, to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
Something to chew on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a thought built purely on the unique, integrated logic of the text we just explored.
Okay.
If we entertain the author's premise, a reality where abstract spiritual states can physically alter the three-dimensional geometry of our DNA, it raises a deeply provocative question about the future of human discovery.
Well, absolutely.
As our microscopes continue to get infinitely more powerful, and as we map the deepest, most complex structures of the human brain with ever-increasing, terrifying clarity.
Because the technology is only getting better.
Will science and theology continue to drift further apart as they historically have for the last 3 centuries?
The Great Divide.
Or, as the microscopic world reveals its unbelievable complexity, will people increasingly look down through those lenses, stare at the dynamic, shifting architecture of our own cells, and start to see the literal battles of the human soul written into the folds?
It is a profound question about how we will ultimately choose to interpret our own biology.
Because the data is just the data.
Exactly. The more we discover, the more we have to decide what those discoveries actually mean.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the intersection of cutting-edge neurogenomics and ancient theology. Keep asking difficult questions, keep looking closely at the world around you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to 3-in-1 Scripture Insight. If this episode inspired you, consider following the podcast and sharing it with others.